the impacts are really heavy on these smaller towns and these smaller areas where there's one grocery store or one pharmacy and that's gone.
Hmm.
Then there's no resources there for those people.
We're in a long emergency. And, in some of these situations, a fire will come and then it'll be followed by a flood or followed by another climate disaster. So we're seeing that time and time again. So I think that we need to increase the resources. We need to come together and help each other heal.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be talking with the directors of a new documentary film, Incandescence. Nova Ami and Velcrow Ripper talk about their unique approach to interviews and sound in the film, share insights into how communities are coming together to manage fire and the climate crisis, and discuss the complexities of fire in the ecosystem. Before we begin today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.
Nova, Velcrow, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, great to be here.
For those tuning in, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Nova Ami, and I'm a documentary filmmaker. And Velcrow and I, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Velcrow Ripper. I'm also a documentary filmmaker. And we make films that deal with the central issues of our times. Many of our films explore, our last three features explore the theme of the climate emergency and how it manifests in different ways and how can we respond and how it's impacting communities and the earth.
And Velcrow and I have been collaborating for over 10 years now. And so we've created this body of work that, as he described, has central themes around the climate emergency.
Yeah, and we make feature documentaries.
Well, on that note, you've got a new documentary out that's now screening. I'm curious what inspired you to tell this story about the Okanagan, about the wildfires that took place, and about the impacts to the communities, but also the community response. What sort of drove this initiative?
Well, Velcrow and I live on the Sunshine Coast, the very west coast of BC, and we typically didn't see that many wildfires until recently. And at one point, we were feeling the impacts of wildfire smoke from a fire that was happening from really far away. And it was the first time that we had felt directly this impact. And we thought it was a good time to explore our relationship to fire, especially in the context of these mega fires that are happening due to climate change and increased fuel. And so we took the idea to the National Film Board of Canada, and we developed the project with them over maybe 5 years, quite a few years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to add, previous film, Metamorphosis, was about the climate crisis, but we traveled around the world to sites of climate disasters and sites of future thinking, sustainable projects. But for our next two films on the climate emergency, we really wanted to just stay home. You don't really need to go very far to find examples of the climate crisis. We're all being impacted, and we're all now on the front lines of the climate emergency.
We also decided that we wanted to make a place-based film.
Mm-hmm.
And we chose the Okanagan region because it's one of the most fire-prone areas in Canada, and also because of the rich history of cultural burning that are practiced by the Indigenous communities there. And so we went back many times over the course of a couple of years through the seasons to explore the impact of fire on the landscape, on communities, and on wildlife.
And it's interesting because we do tend to think of climate change and climate impacts as this global phenomenon, but it's increasingly a Canadian thing as well, and something that we're seeing in communities here. I'm curious if there were experiences you had from doing the previous film that echoed in this one, or things maybe you saw elsewhere that really stood out for you here.
In our film Metamorphosis, one of the stories that we followed actually was about a community that was impacted by a wildfire. And we met a family whose house had burnt down, their community had burnt down. So that was our first real glimpse into what that story might entail. There seems to be a universal arc in terms of what happens during the process of a wildfire and how it impacts communities. And so, even though that was our first glimpse into it, we felt that the stories that we capture in Incandescence are stories that can be experienced by other communities in other places that go through this experience. For example, in California, earlier this year, we brought the film to Santa Barbara, and it was just after the fires that happened in LA. And a really powerful experience to share that with people in California who were going through this and who had just been through it. And hearing from those people who had seen the film, how it really was able to capture some of the things that they were going through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I recall in Metamorphosis, the firefighter that we spoke to there, talking about how the fire seasons were getting longer. And we found again with Incandescence that in many ways firefighters are really confronting the climate crisis head on. And they're just seeing it. These are people who've been fighting fires for year after year after year. And so they're not climate experts. They're not scientists. They're just people who are witnesses to the climate emergency. And I think that that's really useful because people often tune out nowadays to science, or they throw fake news at it or something like that. So talking with people who are just with their own eyes, with their own hearts and souls really facing this catastrophe and saying, we're seeing fires we've never seen in places we've never seen. We're seeing mud burn. We're seeing fire seasons that go all year now. It's getting to the point where I think in BC there are hundreds of fires burning all through the winter. They stay underground sometimes and then coming back up again in the spring. So we're seeing unprecedented. I don't know the exact number, but something like 5 out of the last 7 years have been the worst fire seasons on record.
Well, it's interesting you say that because we did a podcast a little while back with a member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and we were actually a union rep who was talking about how much their postal workers were actually encountering climate impacts, more and more severe storms, the ice conditions during the winter, sometimes when there's a sudden shock of freeze where there shouldn't be, looking at then inside the summer and the forest fire smoke, and obviously having to work in those conditions. There's all of these people who work in these different industries. I mean, firefighter tends to be a fairly obvious one that we maybe might think about, right? Because it's directly dealing with fire. But there's so many other healthcare professionals. This was a similar thing in the Northwest Territories during the wildfires there. Health professionals, nurses suddenly having to work to get people out of long-term care homes and to transport them, and really being impacted directly by things that weren't normally in their job description, weren't normally things that they would have to confront or deal with.
Yeah, and actually, in our next film that's coming out, the third of these climate emergency films, we do actually have an ER doctor as one of the subjects, Courtney Howard, who's also part of the Planetary Health Alliance, Global Health Alliance. And she talks about how climate change is a health issue as well. And wildfire smoke is impacting our health and on so many levels.
In fact, she says it's the biggest health issue of our time. Climate change is the biggest health issue of our time.
I can totally see that. And we've done a bit of work with the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment in the past. And it's always really enlightening to have their perspective on some of these issues. Because again, we come at this from obviously a social justice perspective, which does incorporate health, but they're directly often doctors who are dealing directly with these things. And it ties into my next question a little bit, because I'm curious, in talking to people and getting to know people in the area, maybe in moments of filming or during the editing process, were there moments that really stood out for you in doing this film?
Well, there were quite a few, but one of the really incredible experiences was spending time with Rider Ventures, which is a firefighting organization in the Okanagan. And as I said, we kept going back and spending time with them. And they called us their film family. And they really took us under their wing and kept us safe during the times that we were filming around fire. And we just learned so much from them about their work and what's involved and the challenges. And so our time spent with them was really meaningful.
Mm-hmm. And I'd say another highlight was definitely spending time with Dora Alexis, who was a firekeeper from the Silk Nation. And she is an elder, and she does a practice called cultural burning, which is a low intensity burn that can protect communities and actually help to slow down these mega fires. So while there's carbon being released in these low intensity burns, by blocking the larger fires, they're actually reducing the overall carbon that's released. And this is a tradition that's happened for thousands and thousands of years in the Okanagan. It has this amazing history, and just spending time with her and learning a whole new relationship to fire. Because the film really looks at fire as a character in itself. And there's good fire, there's bad fire, and there's good fire. And spending time with her and her sparkling wisdom and wit was really a joy. And during the screening in Vernon, she was present, and it was just her commentaries. And she just definitely stole the show that night.
I would say another moment that was really special, we conducted our interviews using audio only. So we didn't have a camera pointed at people while we were having our conversations. And that was a choice that we made artistically, which we can also talk about. But one of our interviews was with someone who was impacted by the Monty Lake fire, and she carried a lot of survivor guilt with her, and she never felt like she had the space or just the right to even express what she had gone through or even to process it. And so during our conversation, it was the first time that she shared what she had gone through. And she expressed to us that it was a very healing experience for her. And it was such an honor to be in that space with her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think for us as documentary filmmakers, when there's that feeling of reciprocity and where you can give back to somebody, where their process is of mutual benefit, we're always hoping that that's the outcome. It's really rewarding when you can create a safe space for somebody.
It's an interesting experience. I know I've had something similar in the sense of we did a couple of exhibitions of wildfire and flooding and extreme storm artifacts with climate survivors who had actually come to the exhibitions to talk about their experience with people there. We did one in New York and one in Ottawa. And for me, it was a couple of things which were, number one, like I come from a climate change background academically, rural climate change adaptation, but it brings it home in a way that, again, like you're never going to experience reading papers about the subject or something like that. And the other thing was that we would have these moments where somebody randomly would come into the exhibition. This happened in New York a ton. People who had experienced climate impacts in the United States who would randomly walk into the exhibition, not even knowing it was there, and would start sharing, oh yeah, I was impacted by Hurricane Sandy. And the interaction then between them and climate survivors who had come to the exhibition specifically to talk was really just interesting, and I think spoke to the urgency of the crisis, right? That there were so many people everywhere who had been impacted, and these sorts of platforms for them to express themselves and to talk to other people actually ended up making connections. And as you say, providing that safe space for people to actually have these conversations, because it does feel like, especially in the polarized world where we live in around these issues, such a dangerous thing maybe sometimes. It shouldn't be controversial, but it's the way it's seen sometimes as controversial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing about that is often when we hear about wildfires or other climate disasters, once the event is over, we don't hear anything more about it or how the people are doing afterwards. And so it was really important to us to really see the impacts over time. And the participants of the film really appreciated that we kept going back and wanted to know how they were doing and what kind of support they needed. And I think that was a really important part of this film.
And I just wanted to add that the exhibit that you guys did in New York and I think in Ottawa as well, we've seen the coverage of it. It was a beautiful project. And actually, Megan Pendrick is in our next film, Emergence. She's one of the subjects, and she's a wonderful person. Her poetry is woven all through the film, and her climate artifact of the doorknob is actually in the film, and she talks about it.
Okay.
Beautifully.
Well, I look forward to seeing more from Megan. Megan's been a real leading voice in all of this. So, yeah, no, I do want to jump back quickly. We talked a little bit about your depiction of fire as not simply a destructive force, but as something complex. It's interesting. We had a researcher come on a podcast a little while ago who was talking about controlled burns, basically, and how, particularly, they were focused in the United States, how it's becoming harder and harder to actually do some of the traditional practices to do the controlled burns safely because the temperatures are so hot that it's actually a dual impact of this maybe traditional process that would allow for the wildfires to come down in intensity and help prevent them from getting as intense is being impacted by the same thing that's actually driving the intensity of the wildfires. But I'm curious if you just want to talk a little bit more about some of those processes and how that approach took shape of seeing fire in that way for the documentary.
Well, in terms of the controlled burns, one thing I would say with the cultural burns is it was always just a very small window in the spring when they would do their cultural burning or the prescribed burns in the Silka Nation. And we were always sort of waiting for that call from Dora, like, this is the window, here's the time to get out there and film it, because it is a very short window. And maybe some years it doesn't even happen because conditions have to be just right to do it safely.
Same with the prescribed burn between the Penticton Indian Band and BC Wildfire. That collaboration happened during the same window that Dora was burning, and just really creating that space to be there for that time period. And when we first started researching this film, we didn't hear much about prescribed burns that were collaborations between the wildfire agencies and the Indigenous communities. And so it was interesting to see how that collaboration took shape when we were in production. And now it's becoming more and more practiced.
I can see this problem of the heating world and closing of that window. They're also working on alternatives to chipping the fuel. Because the whole idea with these is to reduce the fuel load. Because for all these 100, 200 years with Smokey the Bear, we said no burning, put it all out. But fire has always been a natural part of the ecosystem. So maybe it's counterintuitive, but historically, not all fires should have been put out. Obviously, we have to defend our interface zones around communities and so on. But in the wilderness, fire has its place in the ecosystem. It opens it up. There are fire-dependent species that only exist when the fire comes through and only regrow when the fire comes through. And invasive plants get eliminated as well through fires. And of course, this massive fuel load that contributes to these mega fires that nobody can get behind and nobody can stop when they take off.
Yeah, well, I still remember in the Yukon helping a landlord that I had at one point brush up a bunch of stuff around his house because he was, pine cones and everything because he was just afraid of, again, one of those things where it could literally burn underground and reach top fuel and everything. And, it's still one of those things where, particularly for people who live in maybe a larger urban center, right, like Montreal, right, between what does it actually look like to see a wildfire, to see the impacts afterwards. I've definitely gone foraging in a wildfire zone a year after fire had been there, and there's lots of, as you say, species that only come up after a fire happens. It's just part of the forest's natural cycle. But the problem of that being oversimplified one way or the other to people going, oh, well, it's all just natural and nothing strange is happening here, or all fire is bad and we shouldn't engage in using it productively and proactively. I can see what it's a challenge.
Yeah, because we live in a time of complex problems, and the Earth is incredibly complex. And we live in a time of simplified rhetoric, where it's just like these talking points being thrown at it. And, that's one of the beauties of the long form documentary and documentaries in general. They're not sound bites. There's time to go in and talk and explore and go deep, because actually these problems aren't surface problems. They're deep problems. And the problem with the urban environment is a big one, because so much of the world is in urban environments and they can feel cut off from the reality of the climate emergency. But then we're seeing things like a few years ago, New York City being sucked in by wildfire smoke. It's like, And Montreal, I'm sure, got hit by the wildfire smoke that year. And that's what really prompted us to even make this film, was we were sucked in by wildfire smoke. We're like, oh, this is real. This is happening. And it's going to impact us all.
Well, it is. And I think that's exactly the thing, is that no matter where you live, you will see some sort of impact of this. Yeah, it's unavoidable. I was in Montreal actually when the wildfire smoke hit, and it was, I think a lot of people were suddenly outside looking at it going, wow, this is not something I've expected or experienced before. And something is going on out there that even if they were only aware of it in an abstract way, they were aware there was something different that was taking place. And on that note, we're going into yet another fire season in Canada, and already there's been a few and some evacuations, I know. We know there's a direct connection between climate change and worsening severity and frequency of fires. There's a lot of fear out there about what the future holds, but also hope that we can find solutions. And I'm curious if there are things you witnessed or things communities are doing that really bring you hope.
Well, it was really hopeful to see communities coming together in the aftermath of the wildfires that we saw in the Okanagan. There were a couple of organizations in particular that we include in the film. One of them is the Animal Lifeline Emergency Response Team, or ALERT, and they are made up of volunteers who come in and rescue animals who are being evacuated and house them. And they also go into wildfire zones in the aftermath to take care of animals who didn't evacuate. And so that was really hopeful to see that the care and energy and attention that went into that. There was also an organization that called the Mennonite Disaster Service, and they help people with housing. They build homes, some people who have lost them after the fire. And they, again, are also volunteers. And they're not all Mennonites. They're a variety of people that want to help. And so that was also really hopeful to see.
Yeah, just seeing communities coming together to support each other. And I think that's one of the ways forward through the climate emergency, is this notion of mutual aid. And it's going to be really key. This is an adaptation necessity where governments are getting overstretched, in fact. They can't always respond adequately, especially when we're struck by the massive wildfire seasons where fires are everywhere. So we're going to have to really rise up together and do things like form emergency pods, in your neighborhood, where you get together and you find out who's vulnerable in your neighborhood, who's going to need help should a disaster strike of any type. How can we support each other, alert each other if we got to evacuate, make sure no one's left behind? And people with mobility issues, how do we help them with some of these tough transitions that might happen in the event of some kind of climate disaster?
I'm curious about your thoughts on specifically how best, and you may not feel like you have strong thoughts on this, or maybe you do, but how best that federal, provincial, municipal government can help support those things. Because one of the big things that came out of the climate adaptation, the rural climate adaptation research that I was learning about in my program, this was many, many years ago, almost a decade ago. Again, communities do have these natural resiliences, right? They have, especially in Newfoundland and Labrador, small communities, everybody's very close-knit, everybody helps each other. But that was kind of getting eroded over time. Culturally, that was starting to change. People were getting a bit more isolated from one another to a certain extent. And there was a big emphasis at the time on how best do those different levels of government, whether they be municipal, provincial, federal, support communities. Were there things that maybe communities really needed that you saw that could be more work done on?
One of our films are wildfires. So one of the things that has been happening during wildfires is that people in communities, there are certain people that want to step up and help to defend their communities from the fires. And traditionally, BC Wildfire is just like, no, you have to go evacuate now. And if not, you're basically a criminal. And there's been a few instances where that's gotten really intensified. The Scotch Creek fire here, where people stayed behind to help fight the fires after everyone had left, and they weren't allowed to have food brought in and things like that. And I think there's a shift happening now where people are realizing that communities do have some wisdom. They have to keep people safe, but there is a way for these agencies to start collaborating with the local communities and finding out, okay, who are the people that want to step up? And as our resources are stretched, how can we support them in supporting their community? And I think that there's some shift along those lines. There's this tendency, this command and control approach to emergency response, where you just come in, you don't really listen to the local wisdom at all. You just have to tell them what to do and get out. And in some communities, like Indigenous communities, that can be very traumatizing. It can be recreating that experience they've had throughout colonization. So how do we shift to another model that actually engages communities with the supporting agencies?
Another thing to think about is that there's no time limit to the amount of support that people need or the type of support that they need after these climate disasters. It's not over in a month or a year or even 10 years. People still don't have a home, or they're experiencing mental trauma, emotional trauma, health issues. The impacts continue. And so it's something to wrap our heads around in terms of long-term support and what's provided and available for people.
Yeah, I was thinking about that and the stories of people, particularly who've lost homes or entire communities, and then they have to go back through, or they may not have lost their home, but they lost their community. So now there's almost these isolated pockets of people living somewhere where a lot of that town is gone, or they've seen the damage that's happened to their neighbors, or they've lost their property as a result of it and their sense of home. It's the sort of trauma that is not going to go away, right? Like it's going to last for a very long period of time. It's potentially intergenerational, right? And communities are communities because people have lived there for a very long time often, and they're intergenerationally. Yeah, I guess as a kind of a second to final question, did you see any sort of things that were working really well in the community to help people through that process? Maybe that either grieving or reconstructing, or I don't know what the best word is to put it, but the process of dealing with that kind of loss.
Well, I think there could be more. Let's just say, I feel like generally speaking, communities are there for each other. But in terms of like greater support, what we've been hearing is that they need more. But also people evacuating from their communities, there's also that loss of community members who are no longer there. So the impacts are really heavy on these smaller towns and these smaller areas where there's one grocery store or one pharmacy, and that's gone. Then there's no resources there for those people.
We're in a long emergency. And, in some of these situations, a fire will come and then it'll be followed by a flood or followed by another climate disaster. So we're seeing that time and time again. So I think that we need to increase the resources. We need to come together and help each other heal. And it's going to be this need for ongoing support and recognizing that trauma takes time to heal and needs time, and it needs support. And it's important to grieve, and it's important to feel those feelings. And there's these different types of impacts that people are experiencing. And I think it's one of the big questions of our day. Yeah.
Well, and it's going to be totally different based on the community I lived in as a kid for a year, Fox Lake, which is in northern Alberta, really remote, that was hit by a wildfire. And their reconstruction process is going to be a lot different and a lot more difficult because of the distance and because of the accessibility to that. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what comes out in terms of support for maybe some of these communities that are not near sort of another center or well-known or part of sort of a hub or connective place. That being said, how can people find out more about the film, and where and / when can they go see it?
They go straight to nfb.ca, and the film is streaming for free to all Canadians. And as of yesterday, I believe. So right now, one can go and watch the film. And we highly recommend, if you can, to watch it with really good speakers, good sound, because Velcrow, who is the sound designer, created this really complex and immersive soundscape that carries us through the film. There's no musical score. And that's a choice we made as well, because we really wanted people to feel immersed. And so hopefully people can access that kind of technology to watch the film with, but you don't have to.
Yeah, the film gives you the experience of going through a wildfire and going through the wildfire season. So Wherever you live, you have a chance to really experience it, what it's like to go through, what it's like for the land to go through and come out the other side.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I didn't have very good speakers to listen to, but I can definitely say I'm going to go back now and re-listen with better. But even without, it was really good. Again, thank you both so much for joining me today.
Yeah, great
Thanks
to be
for
here.
having us.
Thanks.
Before we go today, a couple of updates from Sierra Club Canada. And a note that these updates are just on behalf of Sierra Club Canada and not on behalf of our guests. Each year we hold an annual general meeting. Our annual general meeting for 2025 is coming up on June 12th from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. It's a chance to hear about our activities, conduct essential business, and get updates from our chapters and programs. You can find more information about how to attend at the link below this podcast. Please note that all are welcome to attend the AGM. However, only members or proxy holders may vote on agenda items. You can also become or renew your membership on our website. Secondly, we are hiring an offshore wind coordinator. Are you interested in working to strengthen support for the smart development of offshore renewable energy in Atlantic Canada? Are you based in Newfoundland and Labrador? Well, you should check out the job description at the link below. The offshore wind coordinator will be responsible for coordinating and strengthening our offshore wind policy advocacy, campaigning, program development, and research as part of the Atlantic Offshore Wind Coalition. This is a coalition of 3 organizations: East Coast Environmental Law, the Ecology Action Centre, and Sierra Club Canada. Find out more, once again, at the link below this podcast. Or find all of these updates at sierraclub.ca. Thirdly, did you know that Sierra Club Canada is planting 10 million wildflower seeds across Canada with Dutchman's Gold, an Ontario-based company? 1/3 of the world's food supply relies on pollinators like bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. Sadly, their populations are declining due to habitat loss. Dutchman's Gold is committed to creating a world that buzzes with life, and that's why we're partnering with them on their Let's Plant campaign. But we need you to get involved. Planting 10 million wildflower seeds is incredibly difficult, so please do check out the link below to see how you can help. And finally, on our Take Action page, please do take a moment to remind Prime Minister Mark Carney to implement an emissions cap on oil and gas corporations without delay. The Prime Minister's recent remarks on the cap are concerning and vague, and climate survivors' calls for an emissions cap on oil and gas corporations should not go ignored. All these updates are as of May 30th, 2025, but if you're listening to this much later, please do check out the Take Action page anyway for newer actions. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.